tuition costs at Penn State. An important issue, a very important issue, to be addressed by our Board of Governors. Today, in the first of a three-part series on tuition, we will address the question of, is Penn State's tuition cost too high? And just a bit of a spoiler alert, in part two, we will be addressing the question of why is Penn State's tuition too high, and in part three, the question, what can we do about it? Now, the Cliff Notes version, is Penn State's tuition too high? Yes, it is, and not by just a little bit. Tuition is over 40% higher than it should be, no matter how you slice it. Now, how can we be so certain of this fact? Well, we can derive these facts right from Penn State's own financial statements. First, just a little bit of background data. Penn State's 2016-2017 tuition for a Pennsylvania resident is $17,900 per year. What should it be? Well, let's look at a few of the facts and figures. Now, I know no one likes to do the math, especially our board members and our administration, but bear with me for just 1 minute. If we look over the last 17 years, we can see the rates at which Penn State's tuition costs have increased, and the rates at which inflation has increased. When we do that, we see that Penn State's tuition has exploded from $6,436 just back in the year 2000 to $17,900 today, an increase of 178%. Now, during that same time, we see that inflation has increased by 43.5%. Penn State's tuition has exploded at a rate more than 3 times higher than the rate of inflation. If Penn State's tuition hikes were in line with inflation, the current Penn State tuition wouldn't be $17,900 per year, but rather $9,236. That's what it should be. But for some reason, we are overcharging our students and their families to the tune of $8,600 per year. That's a lot of money. Now let's take a closer look at Penn State's own financial statements to see if we can figure out what that reason is, and see if we can figure out why tuition has reached these ridiculous levels. In the 2000 academic year, to provide a dollar's worth of instruction and education to our students, Penn State charged 85 cents in tuition to its students and added in 15 cents of state appropriation money to pay for the dollar's worth of instruction and education. Now that makes sense, since as we know, a large reason for the state appropriation is supposed to be to help to maintain affordable tuition for Pennsylvania residents. So that dollar's worth of education and instruction, it was paid for with 85 cents charged to the student and 15 cents of state appropriation money. Last year, and by the way, all of these numbers are readily available in Penn State's own financial statements, if anyone cares to read them and understand them, which apparently precludes most, if not all, of our board members. Now, today, for every dollar spent providing instruction and education, Penn State charges their students not 85 cents in tuition, not $1 in tuition, but rather $1.33 in tuition, plus 11 cents worth of state appropriation, for $1.44 total to pay for a dollar's worth of instruction and education. That doesn't make sense. Now, obviously, Penn State didn't spend $1.44 to pay for a dollar's worth of instruction and education. They charged $1.44, primarily to their students. But where did all that money go? Where did the additional 44 cents that didn't go towards instruction and education go? We'll get to that in just a minute. But first, let me quickly dispel the long-standing board and administration alibi for high tuition costs. That alibi being the state appropriation. Now, your trustees will tell you that the reason tuition had to go up so much is due to the state lowering their allocation. Those darn bad guys down in Harrisburg. And that's the only thing that any of the trustees will ever blame for outrageous tuition, because the last thing that any of them want to do, board members or administration, is to look in the damn mirror. So let's take a closer look at this state appropriation argument. Over the last 17 years, the state's allocation has not kept pace with inflation. It has been actually flat between 2000 and today. If the Pennsylvania allocation had kept pace with inflation, the allocation last year would have been $170 million greater than what it was. And $170 million sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. But does that account for why tuition is $17,900 instead of $9,236? Let's do the math. If that entire $170 million fell into our laps, and if every penny was put directly towards reducing the cost of tuition, tuition costs would drop from $17,900 all the way down to $16,133. Still a far cry from the $9,236 that it should be. Only a small portion, a very small portion, of the outrageous tuition hikes is due to the failure of the state to adequately increase funding to Penn State. That's undeniable. That's just the math. So, when the trustees, including our elected trustees, and the administration, blame the state allocation for Penn State's stratospheric tuition costs, are they lying to us? Are they too ignorant to know better? Could it be both? It's probably a little bit of both. Because most of the problem, by far the most significant cause of the problem, is all on us here at Penn State. And the reason for the ridiculous tuition costs, and I told you we'd get back to this in a minute, is that over 1/3 of the dollars that we charge to students in the form of tuition is no longer used for its intended purpose, to provide instruction and education. It goes somewhere else, and no one bats an eye. Where does it all go? Largely two items. One, an ever-increasing administrative bloat within the university, excessive and wasteful administrative bloat which does nothing to further the mission of instructing and educating our students. And uncontrolled, overpriced, excessive, and probably somewhat fraudulent capital spending. Waste and probably fraud which does nothing to further the mission of instructing and educating our students. These are things that can be seen by simply looking at Penn State's own financial statements, if anyone cares to look. And we'll talk about both of these issues, the administrative bloat and the capital spending issues, in far greater detail in subsequent videos. But for now, what do we need to recognize? I think it's abundantly clear that Penn State's tuition is unconscionably too high. Responsible governance demands that we recognize and deal with the fact that over 1/3 of the dollars we now charge to our students is not being used for its intended purpose, to instruct and educate those students. We should be committed to reducing tuition and reducing it significantly. Now, tune into parts 2 and 3 of our discussion on tuition, where we'll get into more detail about what we can do about it and how we can act meaningfully to reduce these exorbitant rates of tuition, and not just have some half-assed pat ourselves on the back 1-year freeze in tuition, which really wasn't even a freeze at all, but that's another issue for another day. We kind of got sold a story there. As always, I thank you for your engagement in this election, and I thank you for taking the time to discuss and to learn more about these important issues, because as always, it's up to us to demand the governance that we and Penn State deserve. And in order to do that, we have to understand the issues and cut through the bullshit. Thank you.